We're back. Dina Doll, Michael Popok, new gift by the United States Supreme Court to Kamala Harris in the form of a decision in which they have temporarily blocked the Biden-Harris administration and its efforts to help not only people and their gender identity in the university setting, but also people who are pregnant in the university setting, people who need lactation rooms in the university setting, just generally people's sexuality and gender in terms of not being harassed or discriminated against in universities who take federal funding. That kind of discrimination can go on for another year or two until the appeal is over. We're going to talk about, with Dina Doll and me, we're going to talk about how this is, while it is terrible for the actual people in universities right now that are dying, who are dying to make sure that their rights are protected, for Kamala Harris in the campaign, it is a gift. It puts, once again, Donald Trump, his misogyny, his being against women, the platform on abortion, the platform against women's autonomy and reproductive rights, squarely on the ballot for November. Just as Elizabeth Warren said, the Supreme Court is on the ballot. Donald Trump is on the ballot. And I can't think of anybody who's a better advocate for this particular position than Vice President Kamala Harris, who, coming out of the Dobbs decision, reversing Roe versus Wade 2 years ago, stood up and took a major leadership role on this very issue from the vice presidency, which he will continue all the way through, I believe, to the White House. Let's bring Dina back. Let's talk about what just happened at the United States Supreme Court. Some people might be thinking, Dina, oh, I looked at my calendar. It's August. The court's not back in session till October. What are we talking about? We're talking about an emergency application by the Biden-Harris administration because there's a new ruling coming out of the Fifth Circuit, coming out of that one rogue judge that MAGA likes to go after because it's a friendly environment in Abilene, Texas, Matthew Kacsmaryk, who once again did a nationwide ban of all of the new rulemaking under what we call Title IX, which protects anyone, any person who's discriminated against by an institution who accepts federal funding. Usually it's about athletes, but not always. I've got a background in a recent win in the Title IX area I'll talk about, but I'm going to let Dina explain what just happened, the interesting, odd bedfellows of this 5-4 decision and what it could mean. And then you and I'll pick up what it means for the campaign and what it means for voters in November.
Okay, so here it is in a nutshell. Basically, the Biden administration expanded the definition of sex discrimination under Title IX, which schools have to follow in order to receive federal funding. They included it to include gender identity, sexual orientation, and pregnancy. They also expanded the protections of students who are being sexually assaulted or sexually harassed by including things such as there being a hostile environment. So things that are very important. I mean, we're talking about children here, right? We're talking about children potentially being sexually harassed in their schools, emboldening the students to be able to get protections there because they are so vulnerable, and protecting the most other vulnerable kids in that school, those already dealing and grappling with issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. And what happened, as you said there, is the Fifth Circuit, they blocked it, saying that none of these Title IX policies they issued an injunction stopping it while the merits of the case were being looked at. The government went to the Supreme Court saying this, shouldn't all be blocked because this now means that like these 10 states, all of these schools, all of these Title IX policies aren't going to be in effect. The Supreme Court ended up, as you said there, with a majority, it ended up actually being 5-4 because Justice Gorsuch agreed with the 3 liberal justices, saying that allowing the injunction for all the Title IX policies is really too broad. If you were going to do an injunction, doing it just specifically on those new policies would make sense, but broadly doing it is really going to create chaos. And these students now going into the fall term are going to have little to no protection at all with these Title IX policies. And that majority, in their opinion, say, well, you know, the appellate court is going to be hearing it in October. They will brief it soon enough. We'll get a decision soon enough. This reminds me of what Justice Kavanaugh said during the oral argument in Dobbs, saying, well, we'll just leave this to the states. You know, people who have never had their civil rights affected, people who have never been in a vulnerable position as these children are more than happy to delegate really important protections that our federal law gives us. That's an example of that. These majority justices not caring that these students in the meantime are going to have no protections at all, because I guess they themselves have never been in a situation like that. But as you said, this is something now it means even more Vice President Harris and her policies, and really the Democrats taking over Congress in general and being able to bolster laws is so important, because the fact that they did this injunction, and I really want to hear what you think about this, Popok, and your experience in Title IX, is very telling, because for the first time, the Supreme Court is taking on a transgender case this fall, specifically the case out of Tennessee, outlying gender affirming care. The Supreme Court has twice before declined to hear a gender identity case. The fact that they're willing to take this on, the leak that we heard that Chief Justice Roberts in the immunity case was kind of unwilling to accept a compromise with the liberal justices, is a really kind of scary direction for the Supreme Court, for those of us who really care about personal freedom, rights of privacy, and the fact that the Supreme Court has ruled back in 2020 that the definition of sex discrimination in employment did include gender identity and sexual orientation then. This Title IX definition matches that. So the fact that the Supreme Court was unwilling to issue the injunction might also give us a fair reading that their direction and the merits, could they overturn that 2020 case in terms of the protections and employment as well? We're getting into a very rocky area for the Supreme Court, which makes our elections so important, and definitely an issue that the Harris-Walz ticket should run on, will run on, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a winning issue for them.
Absolutely. It brings not only women, but people that support women and people who are just liberals and progressives to the polls. As we joked, gallows humor before we started recording, Donald Trump has a knack for getting his old white guy constituency really MAGA, really excited and happy. But you don't win an election based on an excited-ometer. It's not like how excited you can make your base, how much they jump up and down like minions in some sort of cartoon. Okay? They only have one vote. So what is the natural constituency for Donald Trump to win an election? There's a lot of polling now that shows that Kamala Harris has like 5 or 6 different ways and paths to the presidency. Donald Trump's are narrow because his base is narrow, and there aren't enough old white people or MAGA people to get him elected to national office. And he knows it, and he knows it's slipping away. That's why we're seeing his natural reaction when he's cornered like a rat is to try to fight back and bite back at people. And that's where you see his inherent natural racism, anti-woman misogyny come out in full bloom. This 5-4 majority opinion is very interesting because of its makeup. Let's go over who the 5-4 is and who it's not. And then we'll kind of compare and contrast the 3-page per curiam decision, which means nobody wrote it, everybody wrote it, for the 5 in the majority, and the 4-person, 9-page dissent written and penned by Justice Sotomayor. So the lineup for the dissent is Sotomayor, I get that, Kagan, totally get that, Ketanji Brown Jackson, totally get that, and Neil Gorsuch somehow slipped into that dissent. Don't get that except when it comes to things like gay rights, LGBTQ plus rights. Gorsuch is not as reliable alt-right MAGA as his other fellow justices, and sometimes votes in the right way. And here, at least when it came to, because this was a procedural issue, the underlying substance of the case was not decided by this decision. The only question was whether an emergency application by the Biden-Harris administration, prosecuted by the Solicitor General, was going to be granted to stop the enforcement of a nationwide ban that was put in place by a couple of federal trial judges and ultimately by two very right-leaning conservative appellate courts, one being the fifth that sits in Louisiana over Texas, or not. And for the trial judges, they were like, well, the whole thing's really complicated, and so we're just gonna block the whole thing until it's fully adjudicated. And to the government, to Harris and Biden, it was like, it's not complicated. You have a few rules about transgender, bathrooms, pronouns, how they're treated, it being a fundamental aspect of Title IX discrimination, contrasted with Title VII discrimination, which is what most people in the workplace sue under. It's a different title, but they sometimes overlap and they sometimes take from each other in terms of interpretive rules, interpretive law. And so this battle there's always a tension between Title IX and Title VII. So I could see where, all right, you want to table the transgender issue to allow for a fuller record to be developed and full briefing and oral argument? Sure, there's an oral argument coming up in one of the appellate decisions in this matter in October. Okay, great. But the rest of this omnibus, what the Solicitor General rightly called an omnibus rulemaking by the Biden-Harris administration to address a lot of things, why is that put on ice? Why isn't that being implemented? Let me give you an example, Dina, and to our audience. There's a list in footnote 1 of the dissent by Sotomayor, that because every headline here, including on SCOTUS blog, which I read, was like transgender rights blocked from being implemented and a setback to the Biden-Harris administration or something like that. But it wasn't just transgender rights. Here's what the full list of things that have been blocked now by this decision by the United States Supreme Court. These provisions include a provision requiring access to lactation spaces for pregnancy and reasonable modifications for pregnant students, such as restroom breaks, right? We have pregnant students that are students. A provision affirming the legal rights of parents and guardians to act on behalf of students. 3 provisions addressing a school's obligations in responding to claims implicating Title IX, including notification requirements, coordinator duties on campus for somebody in the Title IX office, grievance procedures, and protection of personally identifiable information. A provision addressing a school's obligation to designate a Title IX coordinator and adopt and implement non-discriminatory policy and a grievance procedure. A provision clarifying that the Department of Education will not have been a recipient to have violated the Title IX regulations. And then another provision addressing the pre-employment inquiries a school may make regarding an individual's marital status and sex. And then also goes on to talk about separate living facilities for people depending upon their gender identity. That's a very long list of people that are being protected. I just finished successfully on behalf of a plaintiff in Title IX and made new law in the Seventh Circuit about who is a proper plaintiff under Title IX, having represented a person who was a longtime mental health expert and provider of services to a major university in the Midwest. We won a major decision establishing as a new precedent, new law, who expanding the definition of a person who's covered by Title IX. And then ultimately we got a resolution of the case that was in our client's favor. But so I know this area reasonably well. And it is really important because lots of universities around the country don't have properly functioning Title IX offices, which they have been required to have since at least 1972. They don't have coordinators that are independent. They don't have a proper reporting requirement. They don't have a proper grievance investigation process. They don't have a proper appeals process. And this is another thing the Biden administration was trying to fix. But to the majority, the 5 in the majority, they were just like, I don't know, they all seem to be linked together. How is transgender rights protection linked to whether you have a Title IX coordinator or not, or what the proper procedure is within that university? It doesn't. But to the 5, it was an excuse to just have to delay the inevitable, which is a year from now, full briefing, oral argument, coming up down from the courts. So it'll be a 2026 event that they're going to have to deal with. That's why we're back to where we started, Dina. This is a gift to the campaign of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, because it allows them to look the American people in the eye during the convention and otherwise and in campaigning and say, we see you. We see you, transgender people. We see you, people that are concerned about their gender identity being discriminated against. We see you, pregnant women. We see you, women who don't want to be pregnant. And that is who we're running for. That shows you the broad tent of the Democratic and progressive wing of that party, which is attractive, obviously, because Kamala Harris, her polling is going through the roof. It's a reflection of Kamala Harris and people being turned on by her magnetism, by her charisma and leadership. But it's also a reflection that it's just a collective national sigh of relief. You could almost hear it in the streets that they don't have to vote for Donald Trump, and they have a viable, not just viable, but an amazing alternative in Kamala Harris. I said in a hot take recently, and this is a good thing. This is a compliment to Kamala Harris, not a criticism. She is polling as well, if not better, than what pollsters refer to as the unnamed Democrat. What does that mean? That means when they do polling and they would say, okay, Trump versus a no-name Democrat, meaning take the personality and any baggage out of the equation. Who do you vote for? And the unnamed Democrat always beat Donald Trump. The problem is Joe Biden didn't beat Donald Trump because there was a loss of votes because of him. Right now, Kamala Harris is polling as good or better than the unnamed Democrat. It shows you the strength of the Democratic position when we debate on issues and not on personal attacks. And this, while again, there are victims here, because there are people that are on campus right now that are going to be denied, pregnant people, soon to be pregnant people, transgender people, who have to wait another year or 2 years, or they're going to graduate, or they're going to leave school because of the harassment and the discrimination. And they are the unfortunate collateral damage here, or the innocent bystanders. But the bigger picture is getting Kamala Harris elected, and she has to take this bull by the horns and say in an ad or in debate or in the convention and say, I stand with you. I've got your back because you've got mine, and let's get to November 5. What do you think, Dina?
Absolutely. And, Tim Walz says it so well. We are just about taking care of our neighbors. And I think that in addition to this joyful movement that Harris-Walz has initiated, it's that taking care of our neighbors, because our neighbors are going to be affected by this ruling and other SCOTUS rulings. We, for decades, were able to rely on the expansion of our personal freedoms and personal rights by the Supreme Court because of the makeup of the Supreme Court. And most of us took that a little bit for granted and thought that was always going to be the case. Now our personal freedoms and our personal rights are going to be protected by the people that we vote for, and not just ours, but our neighbors, because you have a neighbor, or a neighbor's neighbor who has a child who is struggling with their gender identity or their sexual orientation, or has been sexually harassed by a teacher or an administrator. Like, that's out there. And it's taking care of our neighbors, taking care of our community, instead of bullying people, name calling people, minimizing people, like that Trump and Vance and Trump has done for years. It's that idea of, why can't we live in a country where we respect people's personal decisions, keep the government out of your business, and help take care of our neighbors? And we're going to be doing that by voting for Harris and Walz, because we cannot count on the Supreme Court to do it right now. And they have certainly showed that with this latest ruling.
Absolutely. A vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz is a vote for a better balanced Supreme Court. That fits on a bumper sticker. Could be a 5-4 Supreme Court if they get in control. Joe Biden only had one opportunity to replace a Supreme Court justice. I expect there to be at least one, if not two, during the next administration, hopefully the Harris-Walz administration. Every week, especially as we lead into the October term of the United States Supreme Court, you're going to hear from Dina Doll and me talking about things Supreme Court. Shadow docket, legal AF, if you will. And we'll be here regularly doing it just like this, day in and day out. Dina, I can't think of anybody better to do it with on the network. Follow Dina Doll here on the MeidasTouch Network, regular legal contributor. She's also stands in regularly on Legal AF when we have a no-show, when we have somebody traveling, and we always enjoy having your. You're right. I love the no-shows, right? And so again, always great to jump on here and do this with you, Michael Popok, Dina Doll, reporting about the United States Supreme Court decision against students, people who are pregnant, people who want to be pregnant, people whose gender identity is at risk. In this latest Supreme Court decision, plays right into the hand Kamala Harris. We'll have more on Legal AF and the MeidasTouch Network right here. Shout out to the Meidas Mighty.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.